governments have the wrong incentives. Think about a system where money is issued by multiple private banks. Each bank wants people to hold their money. So a competing private monetary system, the issuers actually have the right incentives, and it therefore is more likely to give you a stable value money than the systems we now have.
Our number one investment idea for 2016. Trading at 1 times 2016's estimated revenue, this tiny stock is now partnering with billion-dollar giants, filling the huge void left by Motorola to a potential $10 billion market. This company has attracted significant shareholders in its industry and a fund that has close ties with the Disney family. With an enormous 60% insider and management ownership, this small company is becoming a cash gusher very quickly. Learn more about this 30-cent stock at crushthestreet.com/win.
Hello everyone and welcome into crushthestreet.com. My name is Kenneth Amaduri and we got another excellent interview here. He's an economist. He's got a lot of knowledge about things that I'm very interested in. His website is daviddfriedman.com. He's an academic economist with a doctorate in physics who teaches in a law school. His interests include market anarchy, poetry, medieval cooking, and much else. He's working on a book on legal systems, very different from ours, and he has multiple books actually. The Machinery of Freedom Guide to Radical Capitalism, which was published in 1973. The second edition is actually available for free as a PDF from his webpage. David, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show with me today.
Happy to be here.
Sir, you're an expert when it comes to just a lot of things, money, private money, legal systems. So let's start here. What is the major problem with the current financial system in terms of freedom and government centralization?
I would have said that the main problem with modern monetary systems is that it is assumed that the government is the monopoly producer of money. And historically, that has not always been the case. That when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in the 18th century, Scottish money was privately issued by banks, and such systems have existed at many other times and places. And I think that people who argue about how money should be handled worry too much about questions like whether you should have a gold standard or paper, and too little about who should do it. That as an economist, you want to think about incentives. And a government monopoly issuer of money does not have very good incentives to issue it well. That what you would like in a monetary system, the most important thing is that the future value of money be predictable. Because you make a contract, you agree to pay someone in 10 years, and it matters a lot whether the money you're going to pay him in 10 years is worth a lot or a little. In addition, it's nice if the money has reasonably stable value, or even if its value goes up over time. If you think about a government issuer, it has multiple reasons to do the wrong thing. To begin with, a government can print money as a way of funding itself without collecting taxes, which tends to inflate the money and reduce its value. A government can inflate as a way of benefiting debtors at the expense of creditors, because if I owe you a certain amount of money, the less it's worth, the better off I am. And the government itself is often a debtor. And governments can also try to manipulate the money system in order to make the economy look good before the election. So there are lots of ways in which the governments have the wrong incentives. On the other hand, think about a system where money is issued by multiple private banks. Each bank wants people to hold their money. How do you get people to hold your money? By your money having desirable characteristics. What are the desirable characteristics? First, that its value is predictable, so you can make contracts in it. And second, that it maintains value, so it isn't expensive to hold it. You don't find that your money is worth much less next year than this year. So a competing private monetary system, the issuers actually have the right incentives, and it therefore is more likely to give you a stable value money than the systems we now have. So I would argue at least that that's the central issue. If people are interested in a more detailed account, I've got an old article I wrote for the Cato Institute, which you can find online by Googling for David Friedman, Cato money. That's probably enough words to find it.
We can
in
put
which
the
I
link.
discuss both that argument and discuss how a private monetary system might work, how it guarantees the holders of the money that it'll maintain its value.
Well, David, is Bitcoin a viable alternative to decentralize the creation of money to help solve these problems? And I guess that's why the dollar, as far as the predictability, has been the world reserve currency for so long, because it's been historically stable, right?
Well, stable compared to what?
The other currencies.
Stable compared to some other currencies, but I wouldn't say that the dollar has been all that stable by historical standards in my lifetime. If you think about, there was a period in the 70s when we were running inflation rates of about 10% a year, as I remember, and that's low compared to Zimbabwe or Germany after World War I, but it's not low by historical levels. In the 19th century, both the U.S. and Britain had stabler money than that. Bitcoin is very interesting. Bitcoin is not an ideal system, but the nice thing about Bitcoin is that it can work without the government's permission. That the standard private bank systems all have to be legal, because you have to have a bank somewhere where you can take your notes and they will give you gold or silver or whatever it's defined in, which they can't do if they get arrested when they try to do that. And the neat thing about Bitcoin is that it's a system that doesn't require a visible issuer who's redeeming the money, and therefore works whether or not the government approves of it. The disadvantage of Bitcoin is that it doesn't give you a very stable value. If you actually watch the exchange rate of Bitcoin, it changes fairly rapidly. And that means that you probably don't want to make contracts in Bitcoin. You don't want to agree to pay somebody a certain number of Bitcoins 10 years from now, because neither of you knows what they're going to be worth. But you can still hold Bitcoins and use them to buy things, and it works pretty well for those purposes.
Do you think the U.S. government is likely to clamp down on Bitcoin, since it seems to be going against their goals of more control over everyday lives? I mean, even CEO of J.P. Morgan, Jamie Dimon, recently said that the Department of Justice would not allow a free currency, but blockchain technology would be used to transfer U.S. dollars instead.
Yeah, I don't know about that particular proposal, but I think the U.S. government almost certainly would prefer not to have Bitcoin, but it's relatively hard to prevent it since, as I say, there's no visible issuer, there's no bank that you can shut down, and it's a very convenient system. There have been methods proposed quite a long time ago for fully anonymous digital currency. A Dutch cryptographer called David Chaum worked that out, I suppose, 20 or 30 years ago. And it hasn't happened, and I think the reason it hasn't happened is that most of the major governments in the world don't want it to happen. That if you have a anonymous digital currency, that makes money laundering laws unenforceable, and in general reduces the ability of governments to control people and economic behavior. But preventing Bitcoin, I think, is going to be relatively hard, and we will see what happens.
So you're currently writing a book on this, so I want to ask you this question. What is wrong with the current legal system in the U.S. and other major countries?
I'm not writing a book on what's wrong with legal systems. That I'm writing a book which looks at a whole lot of very different legal systems in different societies. And the question, I am not asking the question what's best, because I doubt there is a best one. I'm trying to understand things. That if you think about it, all human societies face about the same problems. They solve them in a wide range of different ways. All of these are being done by grown-ups. The people in Periclean Athens were not children. They were not stupid. Neither are the people in northern Somalia or modern gypsies or any of the other variety of societies I'm looking at. Each of them has got some way of handling legal problems. And in my book, I'm simply trying to look at a whole lot of those and understand them. So I don't think our system is all that good in a variety of ways, but I'm not really trying to criticize our system at all. I don't even look at our system. That's the one everybody knows about. I'm trying to look at a lot of different ways in which human beings have run legal systems and how they worked.
So, I mean, any specific points of interest that you'd like to share? That's
there are a number of them. There are certain issues that run through all systems. How do you give someone an incentive to enforce the law? How do you avoid giving too much incentive to enforce the law, which means that if I charge you with something, I can benefit, and therefore I charge innocent people. If you think about civil forfeiture in our system, for example, that's a way in which a police department can steal property from you by claiming you committed a crime with the property, seizing the property, and then it's up to you to prove that the property was not used for an illegal purpose. It really is a guilty until proved innocent system. And there are a variety of other cases of that sort in different historical systems. One of the systems I look at is 18th century English criminal law. And that was a system where prosecution of criminal law was private. Basically, the victim of a crime, rather than the district attorney, was the one who prosecuted the crime. People worried that there wasn't enough incentive to prosecute crimes, so they set up, at various points during the 18th century, rewards for convicting somebody of something. And then there were scandals when it turned out that someone had been framed or had been lured into committing a crime in order that somebody else could then hand him into the law and collect a reward. So you have problems on both sides. One of the most interesting things that I've discovered in looking at these is that there is a category of legal system which is historically quite common early on in history. In fact, I've argued that it may be what most legal systems are built on top of, which is private and decentralized. And it's what I usually refer to as a feud system. And I should say the word feud and the word feudal have no connection. When I start talking about a feud system, people think I'm talking about feudal systems. I'm not. They are etymologically unrelated in meaning. The basic logic of a feud system is that when you wrong me, I threaten to harm you unless you compensate me. So it's a decentralized system. There are various conditions needed for it to work, and I've discussed those in a number of places. Probably don't have enough time to go into much detail here. But that's the basic logic of it, is that if you kill my brother, I expect you to give me a whole lot of money or else I will kill you. And in order for such a system to work, you need some mechanism so that my threat to injure you is believable if you have wronged me and is not believable if you haven't. So you need some method for what I refer to as right makes might. The feud system I know best was the system of Saga period Iceland. Existed for something over 300 years, starting in the 10th century. It's not around anymore. And that was a system where if I thought you had wronged me, I sued you. There was a legal system. And I sued you whether you had wronged me in what we would think of as a tort or what we would think of as a crime. In effect, killing people was treated as a tort. The court ended up saying you owed me a large amount of damages. If you didn't pay, you got outlawed. Being outlawed meant it was legal to kill you. So the actual enforcement of the verdict was entirely private. There was no executive arm of government, no equivalent of police, government, army, whatever. But there were courts, and there was a legal system. And the reason that right made might was that once you had lost the law case and then refused to pay damages, all of our neighbors knew you were the bad guy and I was the good guy. So therefore your friends wouldn't support you and my friends would support me. That's a gross oversimplification of a complicated system. If people go up to my webpage, there's a link to the book I'm writing about legal systems, which has a chapter on Saga period Iceland. And it also discusses a number of other such systems. The traditional system in northern Somalia was a somewhat similar one in which rights were privately enforced. Worked, far as one can tell, tolerably well. When England and Italy, which had been sort of semi-colonial, responsible for northern and southern Somalia, pulled out, They set up a centralized modern democratic government in a society that had never had anything of the sort. It turned into a military dictatorship. It got overthrown after getting into a war. And ever since then, the U.S. and the UN have been trying to reestablish a central government, and thus causing a good deal of chaos, which we then blame on the Somali. So that's another one of those systems. So that's sort of one of the lessons that I think interesting is that you can have such systems. And our legal system was built on top of a feud system, because if you look at the history of Anglo-American common law, it ultimately grew out of Anglo-Saxon law, and Anglo-Saxon law was essentially Iceland plus a king. Iceland didn't have any king. If you look at Islamic law, it's pretty clearly that it was built on top of a pre-existing Bedouin feud system. If you look at Jewish law, I think there's pretty good evidence of what I think of as fossilized feud. There are institutions in Jewish law which look as though they're the remnants of a feud system. I think you can make an argument that Roman law was built on top of a feud system, though that's much harder because we don't know very much about the really early Roman law. But in any case, one of the bunch of things that's come out of this research is realizing that historically it is not uncommon to have legal systems not run by the state. And that they I don't know if they function better or worse, but they function. That, Iceland had a viable society for 300 and some years. So that's one of the things. There are other things. One of the problems in something like a feud system is, what if somebody wrongs me, but I'm too weak to threaten him, or too poor in a modern society to hire a lawyer to sue him? And the Icelandic solution is that my claim is marketable. So I'm an elderly man, you've killed my son. I know that if I try to go to court and get you convicted, I'll get beaten up on the way to court. But my neighbor, he's a wealthy farmer, and his 4 big tough sons went Viking in their youth. So I transfer my claim to him. He enforces it and collects the money. He then makes whatever split of the money with me we've agreed on. And that's a good reason not to kill the son of somebody, even if he's an elderly man who can't enforce his rights himself. Wow. So I've argued that our tort system would work better if tort claims were transferable, were marketable. So you dent my car. I don't know who's a good lawyer, but if we followed the Icelandic model in that respect, I could simply auction off my claim to collect damages from you to whatever law firm was willing to pay me the most for it, and they could then go enforce my rights, in effect. So I like to claim that in that respect, the American legal system is a mere 1,000 years behind the cutting edge of legal technology, since Iceland 1,000 years ago had a particular legal institution, transferable tort claims, that we ought to have. So, but there's lots and lots of other stuff that
wow, what a complex topic. I've done very little thinking about the legal system to the extent that you're talking about, and I'm just, in my mind, always goes to the free market. Where would the free market minus the government, where would the chips fall in that sense? But it seems like such a complex thing that it wouldn't just figure itself out. And I hate to say that, because I'm a very free market thinking person, and I'm very inclined to think that the free market would figure out solutions for things, and I believe it would. But this legal system is a very, very tricky thing, and what you're describing is extremely complex. My
first book, The Machinery of Freedom, was partly about what a market society would look like in which all government functions were privatized. I was trying to see how far you could carry the argument for the free market. And one of the things, it had three sections in the book, and part 3 of the book was a sketch of a hypothetical society along the lines of our society, but with entirely private law and law enforcement. And one of the things I've realized in the research I've been doing is that in an odd sense I was reinventing the wheel. That my imaginary society was really a modern society version of something like the Icelandic or the Somali system. So what I described in that book, in part 3 of Machinery of Freedom, was a society where there are private firms which sell the service of protecting your rights and settling your disputes. Each individual is the customer of one such firm. Then the obvious problem is, what happens if I think you violated my rights? You have one rights enforcement firm and I've got a different one. How do we settle it? Mm-hmm. And people who want to reject this idea say, well, obviously, you're going to have a little war between the two firms. That's not a very good idea. But wars are very expensive. Companies don't like spending money when they don't have to. And it makes much more sense that your firm and my firm agree in advance on an arbitrator, so that any pair of firms that expect their customers to run into conflicts agree in advance on a private court, on a private arbitration agency which has its own rules for settling disputes. And then when I think you've stolen my television set and you say you haven't, my firm and your firm go to the private court. The private court says, yes, you have. And now your firm doesn't protect you when my private firm comes to retrieve my television set. On the other hand, if the private court says you haven't, then I can't get the television set, and maybe I owe you some damages for having accused you of a crime you didn't commit. So what I sketched in that part 3 of Machinery of Freedom was a society in which the law itself was being produced on the free market, because each of the private arbitration agencies, the private courts, wants to have a set of rules that customers like, a set of rules that will make the rights enforcement agencies choose to use that court. The rights enforcement agencies want to use a court that has rules their customers will like, that their customers will like being under. So you therefore have a market mechanism for what I think of as free market anarchy, that is to say a society without a government but with private property and markets. And you are generating law on that in that market system. And I discussed that in the first edition of Machinery of Freedom. I discussed various complications and additional elements of it in the third edition, which you can get from Amazon as either a pretty inexpensive hard copy or as a Kindle, very inexpensive Kindle. I think it costs $3 or so. And so the answer is that part of what I learned from looking at these other legal systems was that what I had invented was really a sort of a fancier, modern, firm version of what had really existed in a lot of past societies.
David, I wanted to get your thoughts on the economy. You are an economist.
An economist is not somebody who studies the economy, any more than a physicist is somebody who builds atomic bombs.
Okay.
Right?
Well, sir, I do want to get your thoughts on it. Do we have something like 2008 coming, something worse than 2008
I do not know. I am not in the prophecy business.
Okay.
Economics, to me, is a way of understanding behavior. My specialty for the last, 30 years or so has been applying economics to legal systems, trying to think about what economics implies about the results of different legal rules. So that my standard example in explaining what economics has to do with the law, at the beginning of a book of mine called Law's Order, which you can read online if you don't want to buy it, my example is to imagine you're in a society where the highest criminal penalty is life imprisonment. And somebody says armed robbery is a really terrible crime, we should give life imprisonment for armed robbery. And a legal philosopher says, is that just? And a constitutional scholar says, is that cruel and unusual punishment? And an economist says, do you really want armed robbers to routinely murder their victims? Because after all, if the penalty for armed robbery and the penalty for armed robbery plus murder are the same, the additional penalty for the murder is 0. And if you kill your victim, he can't identify you. So that's an example of using economics, which is a way of understanding behavior, assuming individuals are rational, act in their own interest, to make sense of legal rules. And that's the sort of stuff that I do. I'm not a prophet. I can't tell you what the stock market is going to do. I can't tell you what unemployment rates are going to do. But I can use economics as a powerful tool for making sense of the world.
Okay. Well, if you wouldn't mind, please give everyone an idea of what they will find if they go to your website and any services or offers that you have for the audience.
Sure. If you go to my website, you will find links to most of my published articles, which you can read for free. You will find links to a fair number of my published books that you can read for free. You will find links to one of my hobbies, which is historical recreation, including a link to a collection of about 300 recipes from medieval and Renaissance cookbooks. That's one of my and my wife's hobbies. You'll find a few pictures of my children, but they're long out of date because my children are grown up at this point. You will find a link to my blog. My blog is called Ideas, and it covers a lot of different things, so that I've had lots of discussion of global warming issues. My very most recent post was on the question of how you enforce law against the executive agency arm of government. That if the government does something illegal, what can you do about it? And it's not at all clear there's anything you can do about it or how you arrange it. It's starting with a particular case where pretty clearly the Obama administration did something that was directly in violation of a statute, and nothing happened, and it's not clear what should happen. But I've had discussions of lots of other things. Back, a decade or two ago, there was a long series of news stories involving the FLDS, who were fundamentalist Mormons in Texas, whose children got taken away for quite a long time by the Texas Child Protective people. And I followed that, concluded that it was the child protection people, not the parents, who were engaged in child abuse. I've had lots of other things. I write about whatever I feel like talking about at the moment.
Well, that's the best kind of work to write, to read about, and to do research on, because it's your heart and your passion. So, David Friedman, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show with me today and to share the information and knowledge that you have with us.
Thank you.